was in a franchise-type business. Primarily, I was the only employee, although I had a couple part-times. And developed some issues with my hands and arms that became very limited in use.
Very painful.
And very painful. Sleep was a real problem. Had surgery on my hands, carpal tunnel surgery, thinking that might help the situation a little bit. All this time, I was losing money in my business because I could not concentrate. I was deprived with sleep, and therefore I didn't have the enthusiasm to do the follow-up, to do sales, do the work required. Decided that I would just lunge at this physical thing until I found answers. And within a couple months afterwards, the Lord answered.
Yeah, we went to a doctor that was totally not related to what we eventually had the surgery for.
Then there was about a year of rehab, and all this time was no income. We're already in debt up to our eyeballs, but we continue to live off the credit cards. I had a very good credit rating, and some of those were very, very high limits, unfortunately.
Here I had a husband that had worked hard his whole life, always upfront, honest. We did it by the rules, and this still happened to us. One of the hardest things for me at that time was seeing him for 3 years in so much pain, not being able to cope, not being able to figure out what to do next. We had goals for when we got older of doing other things when it was time for retirement, on good goals. And that's all gone now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was really overwhelmed when I finally added up the total debt load. That was astonishing. But God has not given us the spirit of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And with His help, we can overcome, and He provides overflowingly.
I felt like I had lost my ministry as well, because I had been very involved in caregiving, but not being paid for caregiving. So, and involved in card ministry, just any helps type of thing. Encouragement. I had no money to buy stamps. I didn't have money to go in the car to visit people in hospitals or nursing homes. I felt lost. There were some very difficult moments as far as me emotionally. Right, dear?
Yes, there were. Yeah.
We did have a lot of support during this time. From the time, friends, family, close friends for prayer times.
We went to a debt management company, and with their help, we had to pay them some money up front and then eventually start saving in that account. And we started to take care of them one by one. And that's when we really started seeing the benefits of the Lord.
Yeah, when our heart is overwhelmed, lead us to the rock that is higher than I. We went to a graduation party for a gal that we barely knew. In fact, I don't think we'd even met the gal, but we knew her parents a little bit. Another couple showed up that we knew casually, maybe a little bit more than casually, but Dave, the man asked Dave how things were going, and Dave decided to open up to him. And Dave doesn't really open up to people about this at all. But he started talking to this man, and out of the blue, this man offered us a huge amount of money that we had no idea they had to offer. And we prayed about it, and we accepted that, and that was the start to be able to make some of the payments that started reducing the credit cards. We were overcome, but then we were overflowing with what God had done for us.
Right.
I think that's it in a nutshell. Wouldn't you say, honey?
I wrote that on the bulletin cover last week.
That's what he was doing in church.
Well, I really appreciate Dave and Marie sharing their story with us and just being open and honest and transparent. In fact, on every campus, let's just say thank you to them for sharing their story with us. Can you do that with me, please? Today we're continuing this teaching series entitled Overwhelmed, and today we're going to talk about a subject that has many people in our culture today overwhelmed, a source of anxiety and stress that many, many people are grappling with, and that is anxiety and stress related to finances. For about the last 4 years, we've been treated to a constant stream of news about things like a global recession, increasing national debt, record rates of unemployment, declining home values. I mean, all you need to do is watch the news and you get overwhelmed. But for many people on every campus today, it isn't what you see on the news that's overwhelming you. It's what you deal with every single day in your life, because you're working as hard as you can and moving as fast as you can just to keep up with the bills. And you wonder how you're going to pay for your kids' college. And you're concerned about how much is in the retirement fund. And you're just feeling overwhelmed by all of it. And I just get a sense that we have a good number of people in our culture today who are feeling that stress and anxiety in this area of our lives. But the good news is we don't have to live that way. In fact, as Dave and Marie said in the video, you can move from being overwhelmed to being overflowing. And we're going to talk about that today. A few years ago, I came across a book on prayer by Philip Yancey, and in that book, he tells a neat little story. He says this: a spiritual seeker interrupted his busy life to spend a few days in a monastery. "I hope your stay is a blessed one," said the monk who showed the visitor to his room. "If you need anything, let us know, and we'll teach you how to live without it." In the monastery. My hope today is to teach you how to live without some things that our culture says that you really need, and to escape the stress and the anxiety that so many people today in our culture are feeling. And I want to acknowledge something as we begin. I want to acknowledge that there are really two major categories of financial pressure. For some people, there is what I would call self-inflicted financial pressure. In other words, this is what happens when we make a lot of poor choices over a long period of time, and we just accumulate more and more and more and keep increasing our lifestyle till we find ourselves in a situation that's just overwhelming and maybe even unsustainable. And for some of you, that's the pressure you're feeling. There may be others of you, though, who are facing what I would call circumstantial financial pressures. You've had some kind of a serious illness or an unexpected job loss or some kind of tragedy come into your life. And even though you've tried to do things right, you suddenly find yourself overwhelmed by financial pressures. But the bottom line is this: no matter how we get there, it feels the same. And it's difficult. And so I want to talk today about how we can live in a way that we are not overwhelmed in an era and in a culture when so many people are. And I want to give you a principle today, a principle that I think that goes to the very root of the source of so much of the anxiety that we feel in this area of our lives. And it's a principle that if we can understand this and really live this, it will keep us from getting to the point of being overwhelmed. And if you end up in that point of being overwhelmed, it will help you to put it in perspective. And the principle is this: my self-worth is not determined by my net worth. In fact, why don't you say that with me? Let's say it together, every campus. Here we go. My self-worth is not determined by my net worth. Have to do that again. The Wilkes-Barre campus didn't quite engage. Let's do that one more time. Here we go. My self-worth is not determined by my net worth. Now, let me tell you that is a very countercultural idea, because our culture tells us in 1,000 different ways that our value and our security in this world is based on what we own and what we have. And we have this very subtle way in our culture of looking at our material lifestyle and making judgments about ourselves and about others, and sizing up someone's worth based on what they have in this world. And when we begin to believe this lie that our self-worth is based on our net worth, then we are going to make the pursuit of material things our highest priority. And when we do that, we will suffer from the stress and the anxiety that comes with making that your highest priority in life. My self-worth is not determined by my net worth. And we're going to explore that idea today from Scripture. If you have a Bible, turn to Philippians chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. You'll see the passage on the side screens. Let me encourage you also to take out the note sheet that's inside the bulletin. Use that as a way to follow along, and use that as a place to write some things down that you may want to remember and reflect on in this coming week. And let me also encourage you to take advantage of the app notes on the inside of the note sheet. This is a great way for you throughout the week to continue learning, because we believe the weekends are just a springboard, that what you learn on your own 5 days throughout the week is probably more important what you learn here in the time that we spend together. So use that with your small group, with your family around the dinner table, however you want to take advantage of that. Now, before we jump into this passage, I think it's really important for me to give you some of the backstory behind the words that we're about to read here. These words that we're about to read were written by a man named Paul, also known today in church world as the Apostle Paul. And Paul was a wealthy man at one point in his life. But then he became a follower of Christ and lost everything because Christianity was illegal. At this point, he had been arrested and put in prison, and he was waiting for 2 years in the city of Rome for a trial to take place that would determine whether he would live or die. And while he was there in that prison in Rome, he decided to use some of his time writing letters to the believers in the churches throughout Europe in the first century. And this was one of those letters that he wrote. It was written to the believers in the city of Philippi. And what had happened is that these believers had heard about his situation and sent him a financial gift to try to make his imprisonment and his situation a little bit more bearable. So as you come to the end of this letter that he writes back to them, there's this section where he gives thanks for what they had done for him. And in this section, there's just some incredible insight about how we manage our overwhelming financial situations. Let me read this for you beginning in verse 10. He says this, "I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned. In other words, you wanted to help, but had no opportunity to show it. You didn't have the means to do so." And then he goes on to say this, "I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles." Now, as you hear those words, just remember one more time, these were not written by a guy who was sitting on the beach in the Bahamas. These were words that were written by a man who was unjustly imprisoned, waiting for a trial, living on rations, wondering whether he would live or die. And yet, in spite of all that he had lost and all that he was experiencing, he was not overwhelmed. And why is that? I think there's one word that comes up twice in this passage, and I think this single word explains why Paul was able to have so much peace in the face of so much loss. And it's this word, contentment. I think contentment is a key to navigating the financial pressures that you may be feeling in your life right now. Now, let me explain what contentment isn't. Contentment isn't apathy or laziness or complacency. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about contentment. In fact, the Bible encourages us to work hard, set goals, and make a difference in this world. In fact, Paul himself knew what it was like to push hard. This is how he described his own life in a different part of the Bible. He says, "I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep." That does not sound like somebody who's complacent. And yet, he understood contentment. Let me give you a definition for contentment, at least as it applies to what we're talking about today and contentment in the context of this particular Bible passage. I would define contentment this way: a life that is free from excessive worry about material things. A life that's free from excessive worry about material things. And a key word here is the word excessive worry. See, if they're laying off people at your place of work and you're going to lose your job next week and you're behind a couple of mortgage payments and you're not keeping up with your bills and you're not worried a little bit about that, we have counselors we can send you to, okay? Excessive worry is when those pressures begin to consume me and they begin to affect the way that I relate to the people in my life that I say that I love, because I lash out to them in frustration and I begin to doubt my self-worth because of my net worth. And what contentment is, it's just a freedom from all of that. And it's the freedom to say that I am who God sees me and knows me to be. My life is not defined by where I am financially right now. And let me say this, contentment is not something that just poor people struggle with. Many, many, many wealthy people struggle with contentment as well, because it seems like no matter how much they have, it never quite seems to be enough. There are people on our campuses who will hear this message this weekend, and some of you make more than $100,000 a year, and you're not content because you wonder how you're ever going to make it on that. See, contentment isn't confined to any income bracket. We all struggle with contentment, and it's a lack of contentment that sometimes leads to overwhelming circumstances, and it's a lack of contentment that causes us to freak out when we find ourselves in those overwhelming circumstances. So let me tell you three very big, major, important things about contentment. The first big, major, important thing about contentment is this: contentment is not something we buy, it's something we learn. Let me go back here to verse 11. He says this: I have learned to be content. And he says it twice just to emphasize it. It comes up again in verse 12. I have learned the secret of being content. And so here's the first thing we need to understand about contentment. Contentment is a learned skill. It's something that you must develop. It's a mindset that you must cultivate. It's like learning to play golf or learning to play piano. It doesn't just happen. It won't happen naturally. We have to make an intentional effort to develop a heart of contentment. Now, here's why we have to work at it. Here's why it's something that has to be learned and not something that comes naturally. I think there are two things that work against us all the time, two factors that make it challenging for us to find contentment on any lasting basis. And the first thing is this: our own human nature. There is just something about us as broken, fallen human beings that makes it so difficult for us to be content for any significant period of time. In fact, there's a verse in the Bible that says it this way, Ecclesiastes 1:8, the eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Okay, so it's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner. And you eat a big Thanksgiving dinner, and then you find the lazy boy, and you sit down, and you loosen up your belt, and you just go, I am never going to eat again. And then 2 hours later, you wake up from your nap and you say, man, I could really go for a turkey sandwich right now. See, whatever it is, it just never seems to satisfy completely. Like that house you bought that was your dream house, and you live in it for 6 months, and after you've been there for about 6 months, you start seeing all these things that just, they're not good, and they're like so 90s. And you start making this list of all the things that you need to upgrade, or that car, that new car that you got, you were so excited about it, but about a year goes by, about the time the new car smell wears off, you begin mentally shopping for the next car, right? And it's not just material things. It happens in marriage, doesn't it? You know, when you first get married, the only thing you can see in your spouse is all those wonderful attributes that attracted you to them. But it's not too far into the marriage when things shift a little bit, and pretty soon all you can see are the things that irritate you. And you begin mentally comparing your spouse to somebody else's spouse. Happens in our jobs. You know, you get that dream job, and you're like, God, thank you for this job. 6 months later, you can't stand the boss. They aren't paying you enough, and you're going online during work hours looking for your next job. Pastors can tell you this happens in churches all the time. Like you find a church and you're so excited about this church and it's like the coolest church, the greatest church, but you're there for a while and then somebody disappoints you, somebody hurts you. And pretty soon all you can see is what's wrong with the church, and you go find another one and you're there a few years and the cycle starts all over again. It's just human nature that it's so hard for us to find contentment. We just constantly drift toward discontentment if we aren't intentional about it. But then there's a second influence as well, a second factor, and that's the influence of our culture. That just compounds it. You know, we live in a free market capitalist society, and that has a lot of great things that come along with it. But there's one downside to that some of the best and brightest and most creative people in the world spend their waking hours trying to figure out how to get you to buy things that you didn't even know that you needed. There's a psychologist at Harvard University by the name of Daniel Gilbert, and he wrote something one time on his blog that I just thought was so insightful about the culture that we live in. He says this: Americans spend most of their time trying to be happy by pursuing wealth. Why? Because commercialized society teaches Americans that consumption will bring them happiness. This message is delivered to Americans by every magazine, television, newspaper, and billboard at every bus stop, grocery store, and airport. Happiness, Americans are told, is just around the corner, and it requires that we consume just one more thing, and then just one more thing after that. So Americans do, and we find out that the happiness of consumption is thin and fleeting. But rather than thinking to ourselves, gosh, that promise of happiness by consumption was a lie, Americans instead think, gosh, I must have not consumed enough. And I probably need just one more small upgrade to my stereo, car, wardrobe, or wife, and then I will be happy. He says Americans live in the shadow of a great lie. And by the time we figure out that it is a lie, we are closing in on death, and a new generation of young consumers takes our place in the great chain of shopping. This is the culture in which we live. And I've seen the influence of our culture even in my own household. You know, years ago when my kids were really little, a very generous friend of ours gave them each a doll. And it wasn't just any doll. They each got what's called an American Girl doll. Now, American Girl dolls are not the kind of dolls that you take outside and play with in the mud. These are like collector's dolls, okay? Now, for some reason, about the time we got the American Girl dolls, we also ended up on the mailing list for the American Girl doll catalog. So there was this interesting phenomenon that began to develop. When my daughters, and this is when they were very young, you know, they could be going along through life quite happy, quite content, and then the American Girl doll catalog would arrive at our doorstep. And suddenly they were confronted with glossy images of all the American Girl doll accessories that they did not yet possess. And they were suddenly struck with how incredibly deprived their lives really were. And there was incredible weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Isn't it a good thing that we outgrow that when we become adults? Here's the truth. We do the same thing, just with bigger price tags when we grow up. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone. I can be so seduced by the messages of this culture that get me to think, you know what? I shouldn't be content. I need more. I need better. I need shinier. I need nicer. And so the point is this: contentment will not come naturally. It is something that has to be learned. It is something that we've got to work at every day and fight for every day and cultivate in our minds and in the minds of our kids. Okay? Second big, major, important truth about contentment is this. Contentment is not about having the right circumstances. It's about having the right heart. See, this is one of the great lies that we are tempted to believe. The lie goes something like this: well, you know, I could be content if only I had, you fill in the blank. I will be content someday when I get that promotion, when I get that house, when I get that spouse, when I get whatever. And we begin to believe that our lack of contentment is not our fault. The problem is these circumstances that God has put me in. If He would just change my circumstances, well, then I could be content. And listen to what Paul says in this letter to the Philippians. He says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need because he was in severe need at that moment, and I know what it is to have plenty because he lived there in his life years earlier. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. In other words, he just wants us to be very clear on this fact, that it doesn't matter whether you have a lot or have a little. Contentment is not defined by your circumstances. It's not an outside job. It's an inside job. It's about what's going on in your heart. Let me tell you, this past week I've been reminded in a powerful way that contentment need not be defined by our circumstances. My family and I had the privilege of hosting 3 of the kids from the Daraja Children's Choir. 3 of the 24. They stayed in our home for a few days this week. In the image on the side screens, the 3 kids, their sponsor, my 2 girls, and we're hanging out at Manning's Dairy Farm having some good old American ice cream. And these kids live in Uganda. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And what the 410 Bridge did for them before they came over here on their tour as a choir is they went to their village and helped them take some photographs so that when they were in their hosts' homes, they could say, here's my family, here's where I live. So we spent one evening just looking through their little photo albums, and they were just having a blast showing us their life back home in Uganda. But I'll tell you what, they have a very different life than you or I will ever experience. Their homes are smaller than your garage. No indoor plumbing, no indoor stove, no TV, no internet, A very, very simple life. And yet, spending time with these kids, I was just incredibly blessed to be around them because of their just incessant joy and their gratitude for the simplest things in life and their deep spirituality. They would pray and say grace before dinner, and it was just amazing to listen to them. And we'd be driving in the car, and they would just break out in song. And I'll tell you what, I've been getting a sermon on contentment all week long, and it is convicting. Because you know what? I began to see my life through their eyes and realize that I have no right to be discontent. Like one night we're clearing the dishes and I'm showing them how to scrape off the plates into the garbage disposal. And I'm thinking to myself, we have so much food in this country that what we don't care to eat, we wash down the drain. And then we were looking at photographs, and one of these young ladies showed me where she lives, and she points off in the picture in the distance, and she says, over there is the well where we get our water. I have to walk every day and fetch water. It's about a 10-minute walk. And it wasn't too long after that, she said, Papa Mark. That's what they call me, Papa Mark. Don't you try that. They can get away with it. She says, Papa Mark, can I have a drink of water? I said, yeah, come on over here to my refrigerator where you can put your glass in the door and get water. And I'm thinking to myself, all I have to do is walk over to a box in my house and push a button and get chilled, purified water. What do I have to complain about? See, if circumstances could bring us contentment, we as Americans would be the most contented people on the face of the earth. Because we've got the best health care, we've got prosperity, we've got more food than we can eat, and yet instead of being contented people, we are some of the most discontent people on the planet at any time in history. Because contentment is never about your circumstances. It's about what's going on in your heart. And if contentment is not a part of your life now when you have little, it won't be a part of your life when you have much, because it isn't about what's going on around you, it's about what's going on inside of you. There's another letter written from the same prison to not a church, but to a young man by the name of Timothy. And Paul writes to him and gives some similar instruction about contentment, and he gives a caution to those who think that maybe some different circumstances would be better for them. Look at the back of the note sheet, 1 Timothy 6, beginning in verse 6, it says this, and he's contrasting here financial gain and the value of financial gain. And he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, that's true wealth, godliness with contentment, because you can buy a $5,000 mattress, but money won't buy you sleep. And your money will buy you a sweet vacation with your family, but it won't buy harmony. And you can buy a really nice house with money, but it won't create a loving home. And you can retire well with enough money, but you won't be at peace with God. See, the greatest gain is not financial gain, but it's godliness with contentment. And then he goes on to give a little perspective here. In verse 7, he says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. Like, we all know that, but we forget that. Like, whatever you have, you leave, it stays here, right? And your kids fight over it, and eventually it ends up in a landfill. And so when you go to Best Buy next week and you talk to the salesman, say, yes, can I see a flat screen TV that's going to go to the landfill? Because that will help you to keep it in perspective. And verse 8 says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. And then it goes on to say this in verse 19, people who want to get rich, doesn't say people who are rich, because there's nothing inherently wrong with wealth as long as you acquire it the right way and use it the right way and honor God with it. This verse isn't speaking about wealth, it's speaking about discontentment. And those who want so badly to get rich because they think their circumstances will bring them contentment. And here's the warning. It says, people who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money, not money, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs and find themselves overwhelmed. That's in the Greek, in case you didn't know that. When you begin to believe that your self-worth is tied to your net worth, you'll start making a lot of very poor decisions. What you need to understand is that contentment is not a product of your circumstances. And one more big, major, important truth about contentment, it's this one. Contentment is not a material pursuit, it's a spiritual pursuit. In other words, at its very core, contentment is not even about material things. It really isn't. It's a spiritual issue. And the discontentment that so many people in our culture feel today is the result of a spiritual emptiness, but instead of trying to fill their hearts with a spiritual solution, they fill their hearts with material things. But ultimately, it isn't a material issue, it's a spiritual issue. And so Paul goes on to say this in verse 12. He says, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Well, what is that secret? Verse 13. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And by the way, in case you didn't grow up in church, this is one of the best known and most misunderstood verses in the Bible. If you grew up in church, you might remember it this way. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And this is one of those verses that Christians like to put on what I call Jesus junk, like coffee mugs and bumper stickers and refrigerator magnets. And we think it means that if I'm a Christian, I can do anything I put my mind to, which means I can win the championship game, I can start a business from scratch, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In fact, there was a well-known boxer in the 1990s named Evander Holyfield. He actually had this verse put on his boxing shorts when he was going up against Mike Tyson. So for him, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me means I can beat up Mike Tyson. And he did, but he kept it on his shorts, and then he faced Lennox Lewis, and that didn't go so well in the next fight. So we kind of think this is like a blanket guarantee that anything I try to do is going to succeed. You know what we've done in our culture? We've turned this into a verse about success. We totally forget that Paul was writing this from a jail cell. This isn't a verse about having success. It's a verse about having contentment, even when nothing in your life looks like a success. It's a verse about having contentment even when your life stinks. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me means I can have the strength to say that I don't need to have everything that this world tells me I need to have to be content. See, here's the secret to contentment. The secret to contentment is to have a heart that is so filled with the joy of Christ that your circumstances become almost irrelevant. And yeah, the value of my home may go down, but my value in the eyes of God never will. And my retirement account may not be much to brag about, but my eternity is secure. And I may not have much treasure here on this earth, but I've got treasure stored up in heaven. And I don't need to tie my self-worth to my net worth because my self-worth is found in the cross. And that'll never change. A few years ago, my daughter and I were visiting Africa. And by the way, if you haven't done so, I would encourage you to go on a global outreach trip because that will do wonders for your perspective on what you have. But we were in Africa, and I saw something there that I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. I was walking down a path when I came across a simple wooden house. This was the home of one of the families that lived there in the village. Most of us have garages that are far nicer than this home. But as I got closer, I noticed that there was something written on the door in chalk. And I had to take a picture of it. Here's what was written on the door in chalk. God is good all the time. God is good all the time. In the middle of circumstances that most of us would find totally unacceptable, here was a family that understood that there was something in which to anchor their lives, in which to anchor their souls that was bigger than their circumstances. And let me tell you this, the reason why so many people in our culture are filling their lives and filling their homes and filling their storage units with so much junk is because there's an emptiness inside that won't go away. And the emptiness that they feel is a spiritual emptiness, but they're trying to fill it with material things or life experiences. And my brothers and sisters at Parker Hill Community Church, that should not be true of us. Listen to what the Bible says in Hebrews 13:6. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Because God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. If you're a Christian, Jesus Christ died on the cross to completely forgive your sins. Your life is in the hands of your Heavenly Father. He's preparing a home for you in heaven. Nothing can touch that. Nothing can take that away. That's your greatest treasure. And when your deepest, innermost needs are being met in an authentic relationship with your Heavenly Father, then all the stuff of this world doesn't seem to matter so much anymore. Because when my self-worth is anchored in the cross, then my net worth can come and go, and I can be okay with that. Now, before I wrap up, let me give you a very, very, very practical application. What we've been talking about today is a particular mindset when we feel overwhelmed by financial fears. And the mindset is this, that my self-worth is not determined by my net worth, and if I want to believe that, then I will live with a spirit of contentment. Once you have that mindset, you got to live that out, and you've got to make decisions in your life that will keep you from moving to a point where you're ever overwhelmed again financially. So I want to offer you an opportunity to not only know something, but now do something. We have a class that's coming up. We offer this twice a year. It's called Financial Peace. It features Dave Ramsey. You may have heard him on the radio. He isn't here live. It's on video, sorry. It's a 9-week class on how to become a better manager of what God has entrusted to us. We've had dozens and dozens of families take this class. It is a life-changing experience, and that is not an exaggeration. It begins Monday, 6:30, October 7th at the Wilkes-Barre campus, Thursday, 6:30 at the Dixon City campus. If you've never taken this class, I would encourage you to do so. We don't gain anything from this. We don't make any money off of this. We don't want something from you. All we want is something for you. We want you to have peace. We want you to have freedom. We want you to understand what it's like to live with a spirit of contentment and not be overwhelmed by this area of your life. So if you're interested in that class, on your way out today, stop by the lobby, meet one of the group leaders who's out there. You can sign up. And if you expressed interest in this, even this past spring when we talked about it, don't forget you expressed interest, follow through and take advantage of that. We sang a song earlier in the service, and one of the verses said this, Christ, my all in all, the joy of my salvation. Christ is enough for me. And I so hope that's true of you, because if that is true of you, that will change the trajectory of your life and help you to avoid the overwhelming circumstances that so many people find themselves in. Can't guarantee that, but even if you find yourself in those circumstances, you won't be destroyed by them because you'll have something bigger in which to put your hope. Let's stand together. Your campus pastor is going to come and close in prayer, and then we'll see you again next week.